Hi, my name's Brenda. I work at Laurie's Country Cottage, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to make the big Sebago bag. And as you can see, it's a really big bag, and the construction is different than any other bag I've ever made. So I found it really fun to make. But what I wanted to point out to you is, for those of us who like to come to classes and go to retreats and we use these plastic bins, you can put in 2 of these plastic bins into this bag and still have lots of room for all your tools, your iron, whatever else you need to bring to retreat or class. Also, I thought it'd be great if I was bringing a quilt in to be long-armed. I could put my quilt, my batting, depending upon the size of the quilt, you could even bring in a couple of quilts in it. If you have a place out at the lake like I do, I think this is going to get used the most for taking the bedding and that type of stuff back and forth to the house, to the lake again. So, should be a really fun bag to make. Please stay with us and watch the pictures to see how it's done. The supplies that you need to make the Auntie's 2 Big Sebago pattern or tote is the pattern and the fabric is listed on the back for how much you need. You will also need the bosal in our Form Plus, and make sure when you're buying it that you get the double-sided fusible 36-inch by 58-inch, because you will use most of that package to make the bag. You're going to need the cotton piping and 1/2-inch size, and we've got it here in stock. You will also require the Wonder Clips. They were invaluable with holding things together while you're sewing. The glue pen, it doesn't require a fabric glue pen, but I found that it really helped because of the size of things and not being able to pin. I glued the pieces in place so that they didn't shift, and I got nice straight lines on my handles instead of them moving while I was trying to sew them. You will require a bodkin, and the bodkin is used to put the piping through the handles. A tube turner for turning the things right side out. You also require a top stitch needle, number 90, and that's what I used to make mine. But if you're finding that on your machine, it sticks a little because of the fusible in the bosal, you might want to consider using a super non-stick number 90 needle. And that is all that you need to make this bag. When cutting out your fabric, we're going to refer to the fabrics as fabric A and fabric B. From fabric A, you will be required to cut out 2 of your bag bodies, 4 of your pockets. From fabric B, you will cut out 2 of your bag bodies and 2 handle casings. From the foam, you're going to cut out 2 pieces of foam for your bag body. And from the contrasting fabric, you're going to cut out your binding, your inside sashing, your outside sashing, your handle tabs, and the handles. I labeled all of these in order to make sure that I didn't get them mixed up later when I was sewing them together. After you have everything cut out, you're going to want to start prepping your contrasting fabric. The first thing I did was I sewed the binding together into a nice long strip. And then once I had it sewn together, I cut off the 1/4-inch seam allowance to get rid of those little triangles hanging off the end. And I took it over to the iron, I pressed the seams open, and then I pressed it together lengthwise with right sides out. I also press the inside sashing strips in half lengthwise together with the right side out so that they are ready for later. The next step is to iron the fabric onto the fusible foam. Take your fabric A and place it on top of one side of the fusible foam. At this point, you want to tack it down with your iron to just lightly fuse it. Please do not fuse it too much, or the glue on the other side of the foam will actually adhere to your ironing board. So once I've got it tacked down, I'm then going to turn it over. I'm going to place fabric B on top of the foam, and I'm going to line up the edges, and I'm going to press this down in place. Make sure that you don't slide your iron and actually iron it in place, or you could possibly fold iron creases of your fabric onto your foam. Once you've got side B ironed in place, turn it back over to side A and give side A a good pressing, and then your fabric is ready to go. You will repeat this with your other piece of fabric and fusible foam. The next step is to take and prepare your pockets. Take 2 of your pocket pieces, place them together with the wrong sides together, and baste around all 4 sides. The pattern doesn't call for this, but I found with the size of the pieces, it was easier to work with them if they were basted together. Repeat this for your other 2 pocket pieces. Then cut your binding to the size specified in the pattern and place them onto the short end of your pockets. Then go to your machine and stitch it down. The pattern called for us to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance when stitching, but because there's no foam or batting or anything inside of the pockets, I found that there was too much fabric that got folded to the back. So I actually stitched mine with a 3/8 inch, and I like the look of that better. So once I've stitched it down, I'm going to go to the iron. I'm going to take and iron it flat and then iron it towards the back. The only reason I'm ironing, normally we don't iron our binding, but because there is no foam inside of the pockets, there's nothing really to give it stability. And I felt I got a nicer finish by ironing it before I went and stitched it. I then went back to my sewing machine and I stitched in the ditch between the binding and the fabric and top stitch the binding in place. Once your pockets are prepared, you want to prepare your main body to put the pockets on. In order to do this, we're going to refer to the pattern and we're going to draw a line for our pocket placements. I like to use a wash away marker pencil of some sort to do this. Then we're going to place our fabrics on our pockets onto the main body of the bag. I found that this was kind of awkward because of the size of it, and I can't pin it. I tried to put some pins in and to hold it in place while I went to my machine, and I couldn't. So I decided I was going to use my fabric glue pen. So I ran a strip of glue down, and then I placed the pocket in place and just pressed it in, used my finger and put it down in place. And then I went to my sewing machine and I basted the pocket down. One end of your pocket is going to be a lot closer to the top edge of the bag than the other end is. On the end that is furthest from the edge of the bag, please leave the last inch of the pocket or start an inch in from the pocket, depending upon which way you're sewing, so that it's hanging loose. And we'll see later why you need to do this. Now I'm going to prepare my handle tabs. And in order to do this, I'm going to take 2 of my handle tabs and I'm going to sew them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right sides together. And I'm going to sew down both of the long sides. I'm then going to go over to my ironing board. I'm going to press the seam open. Then I'm going to turn my handle tabs right side out and I'm going to press them flat so that the seams are on the edges of the handle tab. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and draw the placement lines for the handle tabs on the main body. Once I've done this, I'm going to take and insert a piece of the one end of the handle tab under the edge of the pocket that we left loose when we basted the pocket down. And the reason for doing this is it just gives a nice finish. Then, in order to make sure that my handle tabs stay nice and straight and don't move when I go to my sewing machine, I again used my fabric glue pen and put some glue down and then place the handle tab over top of it. And in the second picture, you can see how nice and neat that looks. Then I go to my sewing machine and I top stitch down all around the handle tabs, including the side that is left loose, hanging over the end. I forgot to mention that in the previous. Your handle tab is going to be longer than your pocket, and you're going to have a piece that's about 8 or 9 inches long that's just hanging over the edge. Just ignore that for at this time, but you do want to stitch across like what would be the edge of the pocket on that end and leave that extra fabric just flapping. So you can see in my diagrams that I did stitch across it, and in the last one I show that I have that extra fabric hanging off. Once your handle tabs are sewn down, you're now going to mark the bottom of the bag and the placement for the bottom of the pockets. And you really do want to sew these, because otherwise if you put something in those pockets, it's going to fall down under the bottom of the bag. So make sure that you don't forget this step. But the pattern will indicate where to mark these. And then when you take them to the sewing machine, you only want to stitch on the pocket fabric. You don't want to stitch through the handle tabs. The next step is to sew the sashing onto the body of the bag. We actually work with both the inside and the outside sashing at the same time. So on my bag, I put the outside sashing on my black print, and I put the inside sashing up against my dotted fabric. I lined them up so they were even with the edge. I then went to the machine and I stitched through the 2 sachets and the bag body, and I stitched them together at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I repeated this on the other side of the same bag body piece. So one of your bag bodies will have both pieces of sashing on the front and on the back of it, and your other bag body will have no sashing on it. I then went to the iron and I just gave it a light press just to make sure that the outside sashing was laying flat and sticking out. I did not touch the inside sashing at this point. I kept it so that it was laying flat against the bag body, because our next step, we're only going to be working with the outside sashing. So I just wanted to get it laying so that it was ready to go to the sewing machine. And then I took my 2 bag bodies and I lined them up so that the one I didn't have the sashing on was on the bottom, and the one I had the sashing on was on the top. Then once I had it lined up, I went to my sewing machine and I sewed the 2 bodies together. And then what you want to do is you want to open it up so it's flat and you've got the 2 insides facing you. And at this point, we're now going to work with our inside sashing. And we've already folded this in half. So we've got the 2 raw edges stitched to the bag. And so we're going to take that folded piece of fabric and we're going to bring it over top of the raw edges of the 2 bag pieces. And we're going to stitch that down just right along the edge of that. And your stitching will go through to the front of your bag. So please make sure that whatever bobbin thread you have in matches the outside of your bag. Or if you can do it well, matches your contrasting, which is what I did. But just try and make sure that it looks nice. And mine, I matched my contrasting fabric. We are now going to want to repeat that step on the other side of the bag. So we're going to put the 2 outsides of the bag together, and we're going to take and sew the outside sashing to the second bag body piece. Then at this time, she recommends that you hand stitch it. I thought I'd try and see if I could get it in my machine, and it was just too big and awkward to do. So I went and sat down and I hand stitched the inside binding to hide the join of the 2 bags. After we do that, we are moving on to putting the binding on the bag body. In the pattern, she recommended that you sew the bottom center seam of the bag before putting on the binding. I preferred to actually do the binding first, because then I had the option of turning the bag inside out and making sure that I had the side up that I wanted to sew on and wasn't forced with trying to fight with the sewing on the inside of the bag. So it's up to you which step you want to do first, but I preferred to do the binding first after playing with it. So watch when you're doing the binding. So on the side that has your pocket closest to the top, make sure that you sew the binding onto the pocket side first, and then flip it over and top stitch it down in place. On the side that has the pockets furthest from the top, you actually want to sew the binding onto the non-pocket side. So you'll see that on one of the previous pictures, I was sewing the binding onto the black fabric. And in this set of pictures, this is the one where the pockets are furthest away. I am now sewing the binding onto the dotted fabric, and then fold it over and top stitch it in place. And when you're sewing on the binding, make sure that you have those extra handle tabs out of the way so that they don't get caught on you. Now, we're going to go to the bottom seam. So refer to your pattern and get the measurements for where to put the bottom seam. And you're going to sew from one side of the fabric to the next, across that line that you just marked. And then you're going to actually sew this twice because this needs some stability. So you want to make sure that you get a good stitch. I also took a little bit of time to make sure that my edges were perfectly lined up before I did this. And they weren't as perfect as I thought, so my handle tabs on the bottom of the bag aren't lined up as much. So going back and doing this again, I would have taken more time to make sure it was lined up better. So just a tip for you there. And then once you've got that seam sewn, now you could go, if you want, and turn the pocket side up over top of so take your shorter side, I guess I shouldn't have called it the pocket side. Take your shorter side and fold it up over top of your longer side. And now it actually looks like a bag, not this weird long tube. It's kind of neat. I've never made a bag with this style before. So then once you do that, now you want to turn it wrong side out again. And we're now going to do the box corners on the bag. So once we've got it turned wrong side out, we're going to align the side seam with the bottom seam. And I use some wonder clips just to hold things in place. And you're going to mark the positioning for where you're going to sew. I found that this was a little thick for my machine. And if you find that's happening to you, I've got a couple of tips for you. One is you can get the foam hot. So I used my steam iron and I gave it some good steam. And then I took some wood and I actually hammered it flat. And then I held the wood on and used it as a clapper to kind of cool it a bit. And what that did is it condensed the foam in that area and allowed my sewing machine to be able to sew it better. So just a tip if you're having problems sewing through the thickness because it's a little too high for your pressure foot or whatever, that's one thing that you can do. Then once you've got it laying flat and you're happy with that, your machine's going to stitch it, then you're going to take and you're going to sew down along that line, and you repeat for the other corner. The next step is to fold it back right side out. And what we want to do is we want to line up our side seams and line everything up so it's laying nice and straight and flat. And I actually took some safety pins and I pinned along the top of the pocket edge, or the flap that we folded up, but it's now become a pocket, right? And you can see that I've got some safety pins along there, along the edge of the black fabric, to make sure that nothing shifted while I finish sewing the handles. The next step is to trim your handle tabs to the length specified in the pattern. Once they are trimmed, you're going to take and fold the raw edge down and place it onto the right side of the bag. So you can see that I've tucked it in underneath, but it's on the right side of the bag. I'm then going to take the handle tab and I'm going to fold the folded edge that we've now created back to the back side of the bag, and I'm going to pin that in place. I'm then going to go to my sewing machine. Oh, and I forgot to mention, before I did that, I actually drew a line up the dotted fabric so that I knew that I was keeping my handle straight. So I took my ruler, put it along the handle tabs on the bottom part of the fabric, and continued to draw a line straight up. So I had a nice reference guide for placing this handle tab along the top of the bag. I then went to my sewing machine and I top stitched it in place. Now we're ready to start making our actual handles. So take your handle fabric, fold it in half, and sew it with a 1/4 inch seam to create a long tube. You're going to do this for both of your handles. Then you're going to press the seam open and turn your handles right side out. Now you're going to want to take your piping fabric and cut it in half, or cut it a little longer than the length of your handle tabs. And you're going to then take and wrap it with some painter's tape. About 3 inches is what they recommend in the pattern. And this is just to make it easier to put it through the handle tube that you've created. At this time, you can use a safety pin to feed it through, but my preference is to use a bodkin. These little bodkins are so handy to have in your Notion stash, and they work really good. So I just put the bodkin on the end of it, and I put it through the handle tab, and I pulled the fabric or the piping through the fabric. And then once I was done, because I had a little extra length, I didn't try to take off that painter's tape. I just cut it off and trimmed that the 2 ends of the piping was matched up with the edges of the fabric once everything was laying straight. The next step is to prepare your handle casing. So you're going to want to take one of your handle casing pieces and fold it so that the short sides are together, right sides in. And you're going to stitch a seam starting 1 inch in from the edge, and then you're going to want to just stitch a short seam and end about 1 inch from the next other edge. Once you have that done, you're going to refold your handle casing so that the long edges are together, right side of the fabric is still in, and you're going to stitch all the way around the circle with a 1/4 inch seam along the long edge. So you end up with this, and you're going to look at it and go, what the heck is this going to work? But it does. So now what we're going to do is, you'll see in here, and it's kind of hard to see because it's dark, and I apologize, but you'll see that I've got a little hole there where I didn't sew the 1 inch on the short side. So I'm going to put my fingers in there, and I'm going to grab the fabric, and I'm going to start pulling it right side out and keep working it out that hole. And eventually you're going to work it so that it's totally right side out, and then just keep going until the hole and the seam are on the inside of the casing and you've created a nice little tube. Then we're going to go back to our handles, and we're going to take the handle and we're going to feed it through the handle tabs on the bag. Then we take the 2 ends of the same handle. We're going to just pin those together, and we're going to feed it both of them through the handle casing. And then we're going to unpin them, and we're going to take one end of the handle tab, and we're going to feed it through, or one end of the handle, and we're going to feed it through the handle tab on the same side of the bag body. And when you're done, you should have something that looks like the first picture in this on your screen. And it kind of looks weird, but that's how it's going to look at this point. We're then going to take those 2 ends that are on the left side of the first picture, and we're going to just hand stitch those together. And we're really just hand stitching them together just to hold them in place while we do the next steps. It's not going to hold any weight at this time. So on the next step, we're going to take and we're going to adjust it so that that seam that we stitched by hand is kind of in the center of the casing, and that the 2 sides of the handles
are equal distance apart going through the handle tabs, that they're both equal, and that the casing is centered in the handle tabs. Then once you're happy with it and you think that that looks good, then you're going to go to your machine and you're going to stitch through the handle casing, the edge of the handle casing, and through the handles. And this keeps it so that the handle casings don't move, the handles don't move, and also that is what's going to be holding the handles together. Remember I said when we hand stitch it, we're not really holding the handles together. It's this seam that's going to be holding the handles together. So I actually went over it a couple of times. And the very last step is we then take, and this picture doesn't show it very well, so I apologize for that, is we then go to the base of the handles where they're going through the handle tab, and we pinch them together so that they're on the sides, and we stitch with just hand stitch back and forth through the side to give that nice little pleated look. And it's kind of just a design detail at this point, so if you don't like the look, you don't have to do it. It just gives a little pleated look and gives a little knot at the top of the handle tabs. And you have now completed your bag.
So the big Sebago pattern, it makes this awesome large tote. It is an Auntie's 2 pattern, and I love her patterns. They're really, really nice. They're fun to make. I've made a few of them, and I've always had lots of fun. And so here's our extra large tote again. As I mentioned before, you can do lots of things with it. But the one thing I never mentioned to you yet is that I decided I wanted one a little smaller for class type, to bring projects to classes. And I thought, so what happens if I reduce the existing pattern by 20%? So I pulled out my calculator, multiplied everything out, so I reduced it by 20%. The only thing I didn't change is I kept the handle measurements all the exact same. And this size bag works perfect for one tote and lots of room for your other stuff. But what surprised me was it's still big enough to put in 2 totes. 2 of the plastic bins. Sorry, I shouldn't have been calling them totes. 2 of the plastic bins. So I really hope that you enjoyed this class and that you're motivated to make some of these totes and have lots of fun.